So is Missouri becoming more urban? Will it maintain its rural flair? I think that my suggestion would be that we're going to be more and more ex-urban, that we will value all of the urban amenities, but will be increasingly valuing being located in what seems to be a rural or natural environment. That the relationships with the land, I think, will persist because that's so much of who we are. This isn't perceived as an urban environment. It's still perceived as a rural and as an outdoor related culture, and that will stay the same. The question will be sustainability of those outdoors. And if the trends are true that urban people are less and less interested in going further and further out for those experiences, then we have to find ways to keep urban folk connected to, again, outdoor experiences that are distance-wise. And I would echo some of what was said earlier. There seems to be a kind of a fear of the outdoors that is pervasive. Now, part of it is, and I think also said earlier, as I experience college students today, usually they're either locked in or they're playing with their thumbs in their lap. And it's pretty hard for them to see and experience. There's a sensory deprivation that's going on as they join the Borg. And it's difficult sometimes to get them. It was just the other day I was crossing campus and I noticed an intense amount of bird droppings under one particular tree on my regular pathway I take, and I was kind of fascinated by it. I was going, no scat about that, and I was looking at why was that? What was that tree doing it? And 3 students ran into me while I had stopped there under that tree. I was looking at the natural environment, but they were text messaging or on the phone, and your eyes just you glaze over when you're doing that. And I think, how are we ever going to change that? But on the positive side, my grandson, who's about 3 years old, I was babysitting the other day, and he said, let's take a nature hike. I go, great. So we go to the pocket park behind their house, and for him, it was just stumbling down the side of the hill, leaves up to his waist, tripping over limbs, and I thought, this is great, this is great. I followed him on the nature hike as he rolled down the hill, and we get to the bottom, and he's found rocks. And for an hour and a half, he collected rocks and sticks as his imagination, and it was connection. And I thought, up at the house, he's got a world of all kinds of electronic magical toys, but sticks and rocks. I thought, oh, there is hope. There is that possibility that the outdoors will be perceived as a place to appreciate. But our issue will be if those islands are there, they become so manipulated and so artificial. And that's, I think, a question for us is to maintain that. The positives, I think, with Missouri is we are learning conservation. Now, as I said earlier, a lot of that has come out of crisis and necessity. It's sometimes wiping out an environment before we pay attention to it. With strip mining, for example, finally when we're looking at the desolation, we say, well, we got to do it. Now, it's wonderful now to go back and experience those reclaimed lands. Hopefully we don't have to keep doing that from crisis to crisis to crisis before we understand. And I'm very, very hopeful, as I heard Dr. Keller's presentation, to say that maybe human beings are once again learning that we are a part of the system, and protecting it is protecting us. And I think there's evidence of that in Missouri, the amount of pro-action now regarding environmental issues and so on, and heightened concepts of mixed use. Mixed use doesn't mean you market and harvest resources, but you get to be there and experience it in its natural setting as well. So the trends are Missouri population is going to force us into intense urban corridors and urban rings, and forcing natural areas and into smaller pieces within the urban environments, or creating islands in the rural area. The demands of energy, communication, and transportation will still keep carving out their wider and wider niches. Agribusiness industry and service economy shifts are going, but as folks begin to find again that the natural resources can be partners in that, not just to be gleaned or to be cut over. We are going to be experiencing more and more recreation oriented toward the outdoors to balance somewhat that indoor recreation. I think there'll be a kind of a response in the next generation to too much screens in your face, that folks will begin to say, wait a minute, wait a minute, wait a minute. Now, as I can say, I have graduates who leave our department into the technical side of geography, doing nothing but GIS, and they're spending their whole life in front of a computer. Now they're coming 3 or 4 years later back to me and saying, are there jobs out there that would involve the field? I've done my 3 years now in the cubicle. I want to be a real geographer and have contact with people and places and things. So there is some hope that would occur. But for us in Missouri, retirement and recreation associated with the outdoors will be increasing. The issue I think we'll have to wrestle with is not to turn it into commodity and still start thinking of just harvesting what we can get and hope for the best. And Missouri, of course, in the context of our whole country, in the global context, what energy demands and what networking demands, that's going to be a very difficult environment. One last example is with the baby boomers now retiring, if you've looked at the history of Missouri population pyramids, once upon a time it was a pyramid. Now it's a column. We are not replacing, the youth are not growing in the same numbers that we're producing senior citizens. So at least in the next, say, 20 to 30 years, we're going to be looking at outdoor experiences for the seniors, as well as nurturing the youth. And we don't want to forget that, because that's who we are in Missouri. There is a decline in agriculture as we have known it on the farm to more corporate and industrial models. And so we're not going to have folks that understand agriculture as a source of outdoor values. The migration will continue to be southerly in Missouri, to Missouri's Sun Belt in the lake regions, the southern tier. That's where more and more folks will intend to go. But among the age group that is moving there, the hook will be outdoors as nostalgia. Now, if you think back in terms of historic social development, more and more children learn the values not from the parents but the grandparents. So it may be those of us that are in our senior years now that may be the model. So as I play with my grandson, it's going to be maybe a transfer from nostalgia into educational opportunities and positives. Well, one last amphetamines. Missouri has, ranked at the top. Many times Missouri has been #1. California then competes with us, but we tend to beat out California regularly. Unfortunately, the Sonoran Mafia has figured out that they can produce methamphetamines cheaper in the Phoenix suburbs than we can produce in Missouri. So we may have a shift there in that. But this was a colleague of mine who was doing research trying to figure out why methamphetamine production would occur in certain areas. A relative isolation, agricultural-based economy, but access to the highway. and in some ways it represents what Missouri is about. It's a commodity based on the natural resource that is accessible and available to the rest of the world because of the links that we have. This one doesn't happen to be a particularly good one. Questionable future. Who is where? We'll continue to have to look at that, and back again to our relationships with the land. If it's simply economic, that leads to harvest and depletion. If it's only social, then that leads to just sort of manufactured recreation in the outdoors. But if there is a sense of sacredness and linkage, that we will be who we are, that our sense of place, our rootedness is in the land, that's our hope for Missouri. I just finished reading a few months ago and reviewed the Holy Hills of the Ozarks, story of the sacred land of Branson, and how religious values intersected with the natural environment to produce commercial success. I don't think that's the kind of sacredness that is particularly helpful, but it is, again, finding that what makes us human and gives us human community is rooted in our experience of the outdoors. That's my spiel for today. Thanks.